Right. Hi. This is the first lecture on from Memories of the Medieval and the Age of White Supremacy. This first lecture is going to be a little bit different than kind of what you would usually get in a first whatever for a course, um, because it's going to be a little bit more on kind of what we're doing and why we're doing it rather than information, as it were. The title of this lecture is What is History? Which is a strange question, I think, and one which we don't usually talk about. So let's get the PowerPoint going and we will get into that. Okay. So, what is history? It's a good question. It's not in the title. History is not in the title of this course, right? Memories of the Medieval in the Age of White Supremacy. What's a memory and how is it different from history? Well, we'll work on defining memory next time. And we're going to figure out this time I want to talk through what history is. It's a weird question, right? As I said, what is history? It's not something that you'll encounter in your courses. It's not something, or the question is not something you'll encounter in your courses. Even your history courses don't really talk about what is history. And a lot of this is, I think, because people think it's so obvious that there's no real need to discuss it. I mean, right now, if we were ever having if we were having a real class, or well, this is a real class. If we're having a face-to-face class, I would ask you for your opinions about what you think history is. What do you think historians do? Lacking that, I have a couple answers that people usually give. The first one is people will say that history is about events and dates, right? It's about learning that the American Revolution began in 1776 and continued onwards, and that's sort of a piece of information, and that these people were involved and that they did this at this time and that at that time. And then you put it all on the AP test and you get a good grade and you get into a good college, right? That's what history is. And it's true that this is how history is usually taught, particularly how history is usually taught in high school. But it has very, very little to do with what historians actually do and what historians actually think about. It's one of the largest, possibly, kind of in my opinion, the largest disconnect between the practice of something and how it's taught that really exists today. And we'll do some of it, like, you know, the facts and the dates, they come into it, right? Particularly in this kind of course, you might expect kind of me to do anti-teaching, right? To tell you all the things that you learned that weren't true, like that there wasn't a dark age. There's no such thing as the dark ages, or if there is, it's because we don't have enough sources to tell us about what happened, rather than everyone was really stupid for a little while. It's, you know, you don't expect, I'm here to, not really here to tell you this, but, you know, things like sorry, Braveheart, but there is no rule that said the Lord got to sleep with your wife on your marriage night before you did, right? That's a fiction, things like that. And this can be fun, I think, like just the fact collecting kind of aspect of history. You know, we can talk about the things that have cool names, like the defenestration of Prague, which, as the name suggests, was someone getting thrown out of a window in Prague, twice, in fact. But there's no broader utility to it, right? It does not have a particular point. Like, okay, I know that the American Revolution started in 1776. Besides answering the AP test, what do I do with that information, right? It doesn't help me in and of itself. And it is fun, I think, to kind of collect kind of a Jeopardy or, trivia knowledge, to do well at pub trivia or whatever your hobby might be. But that sort of a hobby is not enough to justify my salary, never mind a professor's salary, a tenure professor's salary, which is several times more than I make. Other options, right? Sometimes people say that history gives you a lesson for the future, right? What's the quote? Those who don't learn their history are doomed to repeat it. And as you, or there's a New Yorker cartoon, which was like, and those who do learn their history are doomed to sit by while everyone else repeats it. And this idea was very popular in the 1950s and 1960s. If you've ever read the works of Isaac Asimov, the Foundation trilogy, the Foundation series, science fiction series, it's about basically people in the future figure out they can take all of human history, plug it into a computer, and then the computer spits out everything that will happen after the fact. And this doesn't work because history is messy. We don't have a precise, it's not like a mathematical equation where you have known inputs and known outputs all the time. It's either too specific or too general to be of any real use in a given situation, right? If those who learn history are don't learn their history are doomed to repeat it, right? Okay, so I have a lot of books over here. Some of them over here are about the First World War or the Second World War. And so now I know, having read all these books about the Second World War, that if I am made dictator of Germany, I will not engage in a winter war versus the Soviet Union. Good, great, that's helpful, I suppose. And finally, others, kind of the third answer I usually get for this question, what is history? The history is a study, that you study history to tell where we came from. And I like this answer, actually. Out of the three, I think it's the most correct, but I think it's only half correct because there's the implication in that statement that we study history to tell where we came from, that where we came from tells us who we are. And this means that history is fundamentally about studying the present. I think that's fine. A lot of people will disagree with that, to say that history must be its own thing. It must not be touched by the present. And we'll get into why they think that and what that does in a little bit. But there's still a problem, even if we kind of take that, even if we kind of throw those people to the side. When we say history is who we are, who is we? Right? That's a term that obfuscates a lot, we. All humans, nation, culture, is everything history for everyone? Or on the other hand, can it be legitimate to study something that obviously does not relate, or people think doesn't relate, not gonna buy that narrative, to who you are now? Sure, yes, but not in practice. An example from my own life, actually. Every year, the medievalists from around the world gather in the small town of Kalamazoo, Michigan. Kalamazoo, Michigan, whose only other claim to fame is having arrested Tim Allen, the tool man, for trafficking, I think, 2 kilos of cocaine back in the 1970s. When everyone gathers in Kalamazoo every May, there's a conference, and I think about 3,500 medievalists attend. And yes, there are 3,500 medievalists in the world. Look at that. There is conferences, there is a dance at the end of it, which is one of the most interesting kind of anthropological things to go watch. And since everyone's kind of in the same area, after a long day of listening to stuffy people drone on about things you don't quite care about, which happens to historians too, you need a drink. And so you usually gather with a couple people, you meet some new people, you sit around and you talk and you make new friends. And that's kind of why a conference is actually kind of a good thing, and it's kind of a problem not having it right now. Anyway, at this conference, we were sitting around, me and one of my friends, and my friend is a Black woman. We're sitting around having a conversation with some people after a long day of work. And one of the guys in the kind of group of people we were talking with, we didn't know, and they were kind of doing small talk and trying to, be polite and, ask questions about each other. And when this guy was talking to me, the first question he asked, which is, fair question, is, what do you study? Right? Oh, I study, medieval France. And the first question he asked my friend, again, a Black woman, is, why are you here? And just so we're all on the same page here, this is a bullshit little racist microaggression. And it's not even little, it's not even a micro, it's a racist aggression, right? But I kind of want to unpack that aggression, the microaggression, a little bit, because it has a history to it. And there's a reason why that guy did not think that it was a problem to ask it. Right? And I want to delve into that because I think delving into that tells us what history is in a very interesting and revealing way. The reason why he felt it was an okay question is that it assumed that my friend, because of her physical appearance and nothing else, is not part of the we to which medieval history is associated, right? She is not part of the present, which is the result of medieval European history, again, because of the way she looks. This tells us that in this dude's head, right, and in a lot of people's heads, history is a piece of property, in a sense, a thing that is owned by certain people and not by others. My friend did not, in this man's mind, have an ownership stake in medieval Europe. Now, this is crap, and this is nonsense, and this is nonsense for two reasons. Or a lot of reasons, but two of them we're going to talk about. On one level, it whitewashes history. It kind of assumes that ethnic and visual skin color diversity, for example, what we would now see as racial diversity, is a purely modern phenomenon, right? That if you're Black, your history is a history of Africa and of post-Columbian America and Europe, but not pre-Columbian, right? Not before Columbus, nothing, no Black people crossed the very short gap between Africa and Europe. It doesn't. Anyway, and this is nonsense, right? There's this idea that diversity is a modern phenomenon is absolutely ignorant of historical reality. And that fact should be shouted from the rooftops. I feel I think it's one of those things like, oh yeah, Europe was just white until, like last week, right? It's a thing that people assume, and it's not in any way true. But I don't want to stop there, because I think giving that answer to this guy, to say that no, Europe was quite diverse and therefore you shouldn't make this assumption, it concedes a point that I don't want to concede, right? Because even if it were true, if somehow Europe was homogeneously white until 1500, why would that be an impediment to someone studying medieval Europe, a non-white person studying medieval Europe? Because after all, white people study things that aren't their history in that same sort of sense all the time. I'm an example, right? By my ancestry, my grandparents, I'm Sicilian or Neapolitan, Southern Italy. And culturally, I'm an American, right? My 3 generations of living of my ancestors living in America. But no one sees that as an issue when it comes to me writing articles, books, and giving talks about medieval France. I have no claim in any sense, in terms of my origins, to the property, as it were, of medieval France. But maybe I look like I might, so it's fine. And really, white people can do anyone's history, right? If you just do a little experiment, find a university webpage, go to their history department, and look at how many Asian scholars, ethnically Asian scholars they have of European subjects, and look at how many ethnically European scholars they have of Asian subjects, and you will see that there's a lot of one and not a lot of the other. And this is because the social construction of race, as it predominates in kind of modern societies, understands whiteness and maleness, but whiteness to be equated with objectivity and rationality. This is particularly clear if we look at hard versus soft science, what is called hard versus soft science. And of course, these terms themselves have a history. The graph behind me is a Google Ngram search for the terms hard science versus soft science and their frequency in the corpus of extant literature for the past 120 years or 220 years or so. And as you can quite clearly see, the term hard science only comes into being in the 1960s at the precise time that women and minorities or persons of color are becoming professors for really the first time, right? To entering the mainstream as professors, making up more and more of the professions. But they didn't enter all professions equally. Some of them were more resistant to integration than others, particularly what we now think of as hard sciences, physics and mathematics and that sort of thing. And those were associated with masculinity, i.e. hard. And the other ones, where there was a larger proportion of women, were less rational, less objective, right? And therefore soft and feminine. Freud would have a field day with that, but whatever. And the main objections to a lot of the theoretical approaches that come along with this diversification of who gets to be a professor, the objections to things like gender theory, objections to things like the President 45's little bugbear there of critical race theory. Those objections say that the imposition of these theories is not objective. You're taking your subjective female or Black viewpoint and putting it on real things where it doesn't apply, right? That's what the objections to that are. And of course, nonsense. In history, it's saying that these are presentist, right? There were no women or minorities or people of color in the past, and therefore we don't need to worry. You trying to project them there is presentist. It means you're using present concerns to talk about history. And I want to just put cards on the table here pretty kind of straight off the bat. There is no such thing as objectivity. It is unobtainable. You can't have it. You cannot be objective in any way, shape, or form. Claims of objectivity are always claims to authority and power. And I hear the STEM majors in the back of, on the other side of my computer screen screaming, but what about science and mathematics? 1 + 1 = 2. That's an objective truth. And okay, there are things such as facts. Yeah. And facts can be true or false. 1 + 1 = 2. The Earth goes around the sun. The Atlanta Falcons blew a 27-3 lead against the Patriots in the Super Bowl. Those are things that are true, but truth is not the same thing as objective. The decision for a person to mention a fact, whether or not that fact is true, occurs in a specific context. right? And that context is subjective. For example, those of you who have taken a medieval class before may have heard the name Thomas Aquinas. He's a very famous, relatively speaking, theologian. He died in 1274, so in the center of the medieval period. He was a professor at Paris and has been since canonized as a saint. Thomas's most important work is something called the Summa Theologica, which means the summation of theology. And it's like the massive volume set of, I don't know how many, it's a bookshelf these days of, with the translation and whatever, it doesn't matter. It's a bookshelf of everything Thomas thought about the way God works. And in the introduction to his Summa Theologica, he states that everyone knows and can mathematically prove that the Earth is a sphere. And this is factually correct. I mean, for a reasonably squishy definition of a sphere, right? It's a little bit oblong, spins outwards, whatever. Spherical. But this true fact, right? This undisputable fact that the Earth is a sphere comes in a wrapper. Why would Thomas mention the shape of the Earth in the intro to a theological treatise? Right? What does the shape of the world have to do with God? Well, on one hand, mentioning this fact means that it tells his audience that the theological work, which is to follow, has a rational mathematical method and therefore a rational and mathematical certainty to it, right? That for Thomas, and we can see that for Thomas, science and theology are not two distinct things. They are the same. It also shows Thomas's audience that he was very familiar with ancient Greek thought, which was something that was very much in vogue at the time, not quite being rediscovered, but kind of re-emphasized in the 13th century. And thus together, right, the mentioning of this fact is there to convince Thomas's audience that Thomas is an authority that they should trust. And note that examining this wrapper, as it were, is a very helpful thing for historians. That was just me doing a bit of history there, right? From a simple statement about something we already know, that is, the Earth is round, we learned a little bit about Aquinas and how he understood the work that he did and how he wanted people to see him, right? And the culture in which he lived. But we don't stop there. There are worlds within worlds. What's the phrase? Turtles all the way down, as one person said. Why did I just give you that example just right now? Right? Why did I just tell you a little story about Thomas Aquinas? Well, first, it has a little kind of side task of dispelling a myth about medieval scientific illiteracy. Medievals didn't think their world was flat. Neither did Christopher Columbus. I think he thought it was pear-shaped, but roundish in a sense. It makes flat earthers look particularly stupid, I guess, in contrast if even medieval people didn't know or knew that the earth was round. But it also shows that I know a lot about Thomas Aquinas. And knowing a lot about Thomas Aquinas is a thing a medieval professor, sounds like a thing medieval professors should, do. And therefore, you think that I'm a smart and good professor, which is true. And you should, write that down right in the notes. And if you think I'm a smart and good professor, you'll trust other things I have to say. And this kind of wrapper around things goes far beyond just the text or the context of the thing, the spoken or written context of the fact being conveyed. If you ever have a chance to talk with your professors, if you ever have a kind of a more informal moment, you might realize that there's a difference in race and gender in how a professor has to present themselves. As a white man, I do not have to worry about my appearance in the classroom, right? I'm 35, I've got gray hair, I got glasses, I look like what people think a professor looks like. And I have almost never, in fact, never in 10 years of teaching, been challenged by a student that what I'm saying is wrong, right? At least factually. Like if I say that this happened, there's no objection. Are you really sure, Professor Grigoli, that this happened? My female colleagues have no such luck. They are frequently, and the darker their skin color, the more frequently they are challenged on issues of fact, usually by male students, but not universally. And this has been made very evident in things like student evaluations, where the fact that I am white, straight, and male is worth, I think, one study put it at about a point out of 5 on student evaluations. I just that much higher, just gifted to you, right? Or gifted to me in that case. And this fact, the fact that the person and the means by which a fact is delivered influences what people think about that fact, is as true for particle physics as it is for history. Facts can be true, and you can say they're objectively true even, but people using facts is a subjective process. Okay, so history is the study of the process of becoming who we are. And this study is subjective and intricately bound up in the structures of whiteness and power that define our modern society. Sorry about that. And whites, as I have just argued, have generally been given a free pass to do whatever history we want, right? And the claim that scholarship should be objective and objectivity being equated to whiteness or being associated with whiteness reinforces the fact that whiteness in and of itself, the fact being white, makes you authoritative. So the practice of history is therefore, we should therefore understand the practice of history to be deeply and fundamentally racialized. And this has, of course, profound implications for this class and how we think about history generally. Because white, and that is to say white European Western history, becomes a ruler by which all others are judged. For something to be seen as history, it must have the sort of documentary archival record that defines white Western European history. And so you have historians such as one guy named Hugh Trevor Roper, who is a professor of, I think, 17th century England, if I remember correctly, saying things like pre-colonial Africa has no history, by which he meant pre-colonial Africa has no written record. And he's wrong on both cases. First of all, that pre-colonial Africa does have written records. Second of all, that written records, the possession of written records equals the having of a history, right? And it also means that things are measured in relationship to the European time. Right? And I don't just mean like Greenwich Mean Time. There's a concept that's called coevalness, which we'll talk about a lot more in week 4 when we read an article by a guy named Cord Whitaker. But as the term suggests, coeval, together time, right? As in medieval, middle time. We put things to history that we don't see as European or Western or white, right? Think for now, we'll get into, as I said, we'll get into this more, but think for now about how medieval is used as an insult. When you call something medieval, you mean it in an insulting fashion, right? You mean it as a non-white, non-Western, not yet modern thing, right? And so associating or disassociating something with this white Western idea of history legitimizes, or if you're disassociating, delegitimizes that thing, right? ISIS or the Republican Party or the Catholic Church are medieval because they're out of time, right? They're not in contemporary, they're historical, and they're kind of put that history on the present. And in another way, kind of the work done after, in response to that guy, Hugh Trevor Roper, who said that Africa has no history, served to legitimize Africa to a Western audience, right? That after Hugh Trevor Roper said Africa has no history, generations of historians went to Africa and found its history, right? And brought it back to Europe, as it were. And this is not something that is unique to history, right? This is a story that happened actually as I was writing this lecture, which is that a woman this white lady went to Kenya and discovered the fact that Kenya had humpback whales. And she discovered this. Did she go out and find a pod of humpback whales that in a boat that no one had seen before? No. She went to the bar and asked people, did you see whales? And the people there said, yes, there are whales out there in the ocean. And this is apparently a discovery. And by discovery in this context, it quite clearly means taking information people know and relating it to a white European audience, right? And this is kind of generally an anthropological model, right? That white people can go out as anthropologists or back in time as anthropologists, find a source, and that source tells them something, and they bring that back as a discovery to the European center, to the Western center. And the language of medieval and modern is especially popular in kind of doing this work. As I just said, bad medieval things, right? Religious violence, abuse or ignorance of science, and torture, right? Delegitimizes. But good medieval things, right? Origins of nation states. France has been vaguely France for a millennia, so it should keep, that's a good thing, I guess. England as well. The United States, strangely, we'll get to that. That's a weird one. But traditions as well, we've been, as people in the Netherlands say, we've been dressing up in blackface and dancing around Santa Claus for, 1,000 years. We should keep on doing it because it's a tradition, right? And history is therefore kind of all this together shows us that history, academic and popular, is a tool, an instrument, a technology by which we create and affirm kind of a collective identity. Different layers of different histories, different identities, right? Different valences of the same identity. And this can be good or bad. I've spent a lot of time in this lecture talking about the bad, but later in this course, particularly kind of in the middle towards the end, we will spend a lot more time looking at ways to move forward, to ways that you can use history positively in both popular and kind of academic ways. And kind of the inspiration and what we're trying to do here, I think, is best defined by a quote that this guy said. This is a guy named Bloch, Mark Bloch. He was a fantastic historian of medieval Europe, one of the greatest, was also profoundly aware of the importance of history and the importance of engaging in the present. When the Germans invaded France in 1941, he joined the French resistance and was eventually shot and killed by a Nazi firing squad in 1944 as they liquidated prisoners before they fled the Allied advance after D-Day. And Bloch said, in a work that he actually wrote when he was part of the resistance, and might have actually been written while he was imprisoned by the Nazis. He said, quote, "Misunderstanding the present is the inevitable consequence of ignorance of the past, but one may wear themselves out just as fruitlessly in seeking to understand the past if they are totally ignorant of the present. This faculty of understanding the living is, in truth, the master quality of the historian. And this course is more or less foundational to, or sorry, this quote is more or less foundational to this course. And then, yeah, in this course, right, we will be reading works that were written in the Middle Ages. We will be reading works that were written about the Middle Ages, and we will be reading works that were written because they were inspired by the Middle Ages. And by doing this, by looking at all these things together, along with kind of the history of history itself, we were going to try to understand why and how the Middle Ages are used and have been used to create and to destroy. When we do this, when we kind of work through this process, it will provide you with the tools to recognize how history is used and how to use it yourself. And these tools are not restricted really to history. They're any aspect of human endeavor. In other words, the purpose of this course, the purpose of thinking through these problems, is to give you the understanding of the living, which is the master quality of the historian. And that's it for today's lecture. I hope you enjoyed. I hope to see you next week. And remember, if you have any questions about anything in the lecture, please email them to me by around noon on Thursday, and I will try to answer those as soon as I possibly can. All right. Thanks, guys. See ya.